Today on Nate Makes, we're going to show you how to install hardwood flooring. Let's get to it. So the first thing I do is vacuum. This both cleans the floor as well as helps me find any nails or humps in the floor that need sanding. Next, I lay down a paper and asphalt underlayment. This prevents moisture from coming up from below and causing any issues like separation, expansion, cracking, or warping in the flooring. This is most important on a concrete slab or over the crawl space, but it's good practice to do it everywhere. I just staple it down with a few staples just to keep it in place. Next, you want to measure things for square so that you don't end up with triangle pieces when you get to the other side. Here I'm following the wall with a chalk line and then measuring it to make sure I'll be straight when I go around the corner. This is something you always want to check. A lot of flooring will grow as you lay it because of the gaps between the boards. I've had bamboo flooring that grew 1/8 of an inch per piece. That can really mess up your layout, especially going from a room to a hallway and back to a room. These boards measure 8 7/8. My tape was a little off. So if you take 8 boards and put them together, you should end up with 8 times the width of the board, 8 7/8, which is 71 inches, which we get. Which means we can measure exactly to the other wall and figure out if we need to cut our starting course to avoid having a sliver on the finishing side. Nobody likes to look at a seam right underneath their base. This is what I'll be using to fasten the boards to the subfloor. It's a pneumatic flooring nailer. They're kind of expensive, but you can usually rent one from Home Depot or your local rental store. You hook it up to an air compressor and whack it with a rubber mallet. The mallet's designed so that when you whack the boards, it doesn't damage the finished top side. Okay, for the starter course, I measure out from the wall the width of my board and add 3/8 of an inch for my expansion gap. Then I snap a line. This way, I have a straight line to align my first course to. I double check that that line is parallel with the other line I snapped. Then you want to start with long boards so the first course is as straight as possible. Once they are in place on the line, I take a couple of screws and put them in, touching the boards, but not in the boards, between the wall and the flooring. That way the boards don't slide off the line. Once all of the starting course is in place, I take an 18 gauge nail gun and, nailing about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge so that it will be covered by the base, I nail every 6 inches. All my nail guns are Hitachi, and I just like them best. I think they're good quality, and if all your guns are the same, you can take them to the same place to be repaired if you ever need to have them repaired. These are the fasteners I'll be using. They're a 2-inch flooring staple. The flooring gun also shoots cleats, which are like a staple cut in half. I just think the staples hold better. I probably should have started on a test piece because I had to use a punch to drive some of these home. I had to fiddle with the compressor a couple times before I found the right pressure. You want the fastener just flush, not past or it might split, and not proud or the next piece won't want to go on. I'm gentle with the first couple rows so I don't knock them out of line. I gap the end pieces 3/8 from the wall, just like I did on the edges. It doesn't take much of a tap to make the nailer fire, so you don't really have to wail on it. I nail all of the boards at a spacing of about 8 to 12 inches apart. Small pieces get at least 2 staples. Here is more of the same, just tapping the boards in there, stapling them off. I'll show you a trick for cutting the end pieces here in a minute. Okay, so when you get to a corner like this, there's a really easy way to set this up with very little measuring. So I've got a couple pieces in here that are not nailed in, they're just spacers. So you stick them in, make sure they're tight, and then you want long boards. You got a really long one there, and then another really long one over there. And in this case, this worked out perfectly to go all the way to the end. Then you stick another long one on the outside, and you be very meticulous lining them up so that there's no cracks or gaps in it, so it's as square and straight as possible. Then you take a piece, just a small piece, with the tongue still on it, and you hold it up against the side there, and then you can take your pencil and just scribe it, as well as right here. Stick it past about a 1/4, 3/8 of an inch. Scribe that. And then you just work your way all the way down, because walls are not straight. And so this will help if the wall is at an angle or maybe bowed. You can curve the board around the wall so that you don't have a gap between your base and your flooring. And then you just continue on like normal. One thing that you will find out is that a surprising amount of time is spent just moving the boards around and deciding what lengths go where. You'll notice I'm inspecting these boards for defects before I put them in. Some had split ends, and I used those in spots that I could cut those ends off. Notice I laid this board backwards, tongue to the wall. I also gapped the end 3/8 away from the wall. Now I'll make a mark where it meets its neighbor, and after I cut it, it will drop right in with the appropriate amount of space. It's helpful if you're working with splintery wood like bamboo to cut from the backside to reduce tear out and splinters. This piece I'm scribing is not stapled down. I'll cut it and replace it with a different whole piece. Then the piece I cut will fit next to the wall. These are the whole pieces that I replaced that cut piece with, and you'll see the cut piece that I'm about to put in. And there it goes. Now in order to scribe this next piece, I have to get it a board width past, so this piece is just a spacer. Now I'll put the actual piece down, making sure it's gapped properly, scribe, cut, and continue on. Time for a new battery. Here, the nailer won't fit up against the wall, so I'll have to do that bit by hand with the 18 gauge. When nailing by hand, it's important to hold the gun at a 45-degree angle. Too far leaned over and the nails will curl up under the piece and not go into the floor. Too straight up and down and the nail will come out under the tongue and get in the way of the next piece. So let's say you have a stubborn piece that doesn't want to go in, but it's up against the wall. You can use a pry bar, but you risk damaging the drywall. Or you can use a pull bar. I'll put a link in the description. A chunk of scrap with the groove on it is also handy for pounding. Sometimes the pieces are slightly warped or just won't go in. Another trick is to screw a scrap block to the floor and pry off of it with the pull bar or pry bar. Then, just unscrew it when you're done. So, when I get to a wall, I lay out 2 courses so I can make sure all of the joints are staggered how I want them. Then, I lay out the last course and scribe it. I also cut the ends to length before I do this. On this piece, I offset it 1 course just like the others and very carefully line the ends up and mark it. Now that I have the final row all ripped down and ready, I can put in the final full course. These final courses can be tricky to put together since you can't use a hammer very well that close to the wall. One option is to use the pull bar, but in this case I opted to use some reversible clamps. You just have to be careful with the drywall, as doing this can cause a nail pop. If you do try this, try it at your own risk. You'll also see I put a scrap piece between the wall and the clamp to avoid crushing the drywall and spread the pressure. I want to make sure to get the clamp as low on the wall as possible to make sure it's pushing against the bottom plate of the wall. Again, the pull bar is a safer option, but in this case, doing it this way was easier for me. With this final course, it's almost impossible to get them in without a pry bar or a pull bar. Here, I'm using the pull bar to pry against the bottom plate of the wall. It crushed the drywall in a few places, and I probably should have used the hammer, but it's my project, and I know I'm going to cover it up with the baseboard later. Once the board is in place, I end how I started, by nailing every 6 to 8 inches, about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. And here's the finished project. It took me just about 1.5 days to do it. I've got another video coming on making some custom stair nosing. If you learned something or liked watching me do this, please consider liking and subscribing. If you have any feedback, questions, or tools you like to use, please leave a comment below. And until next time, have fun making something.